A man offers $2 to clean his restaurant, and only an elderly janitor accepts. Little did he know that moments later, this bad offer would give him an excellent reward. The bustling streets of downtown echoed with the cacophony of city life, car, horns blaring, the chatter of pedestrians and the distant wail of sirens. Amidst this urban symphony, a man named George stood on the corner of 5th and Main, his eyes scanning the faces of passers-by with an intensity that seemed out of place in the rush of the morning commute. George was an unremarkable figure at first glance. Average height, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and clothes that spoke of comfort rather than fashion. But there was something in his gaze, a mixture of determination and mischief that hinted at more beneath the surface. As the crowd surged around him, George approached a young woman in a crisp business suit. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the din. "I have a proposition for you. Would you be willing to clean my restaurant for just $2? The woman's steps faltered, and she turned to face George with a look of utter bewilderment. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, certain she must have misheard. George repeated his offer, his expression earnest. The woman's face contorted in a mix of confusion and disdain. "Are you serious?" she scoffed. $2? That's insulting. I have a real job to get to." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, shaking her head in disbelief. Undeterred, George moved on to his next target, a middle-aged man engrossed in his smartphone. The response was equally dismissive, though tinged with irritation. "Get lost, buddy," the man growled, not even bothering to look up from his screen. As the morning wore on, George's unusual request met with a barrage of reactions, incredulous laughter, angry rebukes, and cold indifference. Some hurried past, without acknowledging him at all, as if he were invisible. Others muttered under their breath about the audacity of such a paltry offer. With each rejection, George's shoulders seemed to slump a little more, his voice growing quieter, more hesitant. To the casual observer, he appeared to be a man slowly crushed by the weight of repeated humiliation. But those who looked closer might have noticed the glimmer of purpose that never left his eyes, the way he scanned the crowd as if searching for something or someone specific. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows on the city streets, George's gaze fell upon an elderly man shuffling along the sidewalk. The man's weathered face was a map of wrinkles, his rheumy eyes downcast as he navigated the uneven pavement with careful, pained steps. George approached him, his voice gentle now, almost reluctant. "Excuse me, sir," he began. "I have a small job that needs doing. Would you be willing to clean my restaurant for $2? The old man's head lifted slowly, his tired eyes meeting George's. For a moment there was silence between them, a pocket of stillness in the relentless flow of city life. Then, with a voice as fragile as autumn leaves, the old man spoke. "Yes," he said simply, a tremor in his tone betraying a desperation that cut through George's carefully constructed experiment. "Yes, I'll do it." George blinked, taken aback by the raw need in the man's voice. He had been prepared for another rejection, another moment of manufactured humiliation. Instead, he found himself face to face with a story far more compelling than the one he had set out to create. "What's your name?" George asked, his scripted persona falling away in the face of genuine curiosity. "Frank," the old man replied, his gnarled hands fidgeting with the frayed cuffs of his worn jacket. "My name is Frank." As they stood there on the busy street corner, an unexpected connection forming between them, neither Frank nor George could have anticipated how this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. The stage was set for a journey that would challenge their perceptions, test their humanity, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary power of compassion in a world all too often indifferent to individual struggles. The walk to George's restaurant was slow and laborious. Frank's every step seemed to be a negotiation with gravity, his aged body protesting each movement. George found himself unconsciously matching the old man's pace, his mind racing with questions about the life that had brought Frank to this point. As they approached the modest storefront of George's diner, Frank's eyes took in the faded sign and slightly grimy windows with a mix of resignation and determination. This was not a place that spoke of easy work or quick money, but to Frank, it represented something far more valuable, an opportunity, however small, to earn what he so desperately needed. George unlocked the door, the bell above tinkling softly as they entered. The interior was dim, chairs still upturned on tables from the previous night's closing. The air hung heavy with the lingering sense of coffee and grilled food. "The cleaning supplies are in that closet over there," George said, gesturing to a door near the back. "Take your time and let me know if you need anything." Frank nodded silently, shuffling towards the supply closet. As he reached for a mop and bucket, a grimace of pain flashed across his face, quickly suppressed but not quick enough to escape George's notice. While Frank began his work, George retreated behind the counter, ostensibly to sort through some paperwork. In reality, he found himself unable to focus on anything but the elderly man, slowly making his way across the diner floor. Frank's movements were methodical, each sweep of the mop deliberate and careful. But beneath the concentration evident on his weathered face, there was an undercurrent of something else, a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical fatigue. As the morning wore on, George watched Frank struggle with tasks that should have been simple. Bending to scrub a stubborn stain on the floor clearly caused him significant discomfort, and reaching to dust the higher shelves left him breathless and trembling. At one point, while attempting to right himself after cleaning under a table, Frank's knee buckled. He caught himself on the edge of a nearby booth, but not before a soft gasp of pain escaped his lips. George started forward, concern etched on his face, but Frank waved him off with a forced smile. "I'm all right," he wheezed, slowly straightening up. "Just these old bones complaining, you know how it is." But George did know, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. He saw in Frank's determined efforts and stoic endurance a reflection of his own father in his later years, a proud man brought low by age and circumstance, yet unwilling to admit defeat. As Frank resumed his work, moving with renewed caution, George found himself lost in memories. He recalled his father's struggles with failing health, the way he had tried to hide his pain and vulnerability from his family. The parallels between his father's silent suffering and Frank's current plight were uncomfortably clear. George's thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud. He looked up to see Frank on his knees, the mop handle clattering to the floor beside him. For a moment the old man remained there, head bowed, his entire body seeming to sag under an invisible weight. George rushed over, kneeling beside Frank. "Are you hurt? Should I call someone?" Frank shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. No, I'm fine, just give me a moment." But it was clear that Frank was far from fine. The shame and frustration radiating from him were palpable, filling the air between them with unspoken anguish. "Why am I still here?" Frank whispered, the words barely audible, clearly not meant for George's ears. The raw pain in his voice cut through George's carefully constructed experiment, leaving him face to face with the very real consequences of a life worn thin by hardship and time. In that moment, as he helped Frank to his feet, George realized that what had begun as a social experiment had become something far more profound. He had set out to prove a point about human nature and societal indifference, but instead found himself confronted with a story of resilience, desperation, and quiet dignity that demanded more than mere observation. As Frank leaned heavily on him, catching his breath, George made a decision. This was no longer about creating a viral video or making a statement. It was about understanding the man before him, about seeing beyond the frail exterior to the lifetime of experiences that had shaped him. "Frank," George said gently, "why don't we take a break? I think it's time we had a talk." The diner's small break room was a stark contrast to the dining area Frank had been cleaning. Where the main room was all hard surfaces and utilitarian design, this space held a lived-in warmth. A battered couch sagged against one wall, flanked by mismatched chairs that spoke of years of use. A coffee maker gurgled in the corner, filling the air with the rich aroma of fresh brew. George guided Frank to the couch, noting how the old man sank into it with a mix of relief and hesitation, as if unsure he was allowed such comfort. Taking a seat across from him, George poured 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Frank. "Thank you," Frank murmured, his gnarled hands wrapping around the warm ceramic. The steam rising from the mug seemed to soften the lines of worry etched into his face, if only for a moment. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside and the occasional clink of cup against saucer. George found himself at a loss, the carefully scripted questions he had prepared for his experiment suddenly seeming hollow and inadequate. It was Frank who finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not as strong as I used to be, but I can finish the job, I promise. I just need a little more time." The earnestness in Frank's tone, the desperate need to prove his worth, struck George to his core. "There's no rush," he assured him. "Take all the time you need. In fact, I'd like to hear more about you if you're willing to share." Frank looked up, surprise flickering across his face. It was clear that he wasn't used to people showing interest in his life. He took a sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts, before beginning to speak. "I've been a janitor most of my life," he said, a note of pride creeping into his voice despite the humble nature of the profession. "Started when I first came to this country, almost 50 years ago now. Came with nothing but dreams and a willingness to work hard." As Frank spoke, his story unfolded like a faded photograph coming into focus. He painted a picture of a young man full of hope, crossing an ocean with little more than the clothes on his back and a heart full of ambition. America, to him, had been a land of promise, a place where hard work could turn dreams into reality. "I met my Helen not long after I arrived," Frank continued, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She was working as a waitress in a diner not unlike this one. It was love at first sight, at least for me. Took a bit longer to convince her, mind you." George found himself leaning forward, captivated by the warmth in Frank's voice as he spoke of his wife. It was clear that even after all these years, Helen remained the center of Frank's world. But as Frank's tale progressed, the light in his eyes began to dim. He spoke of years of struggle, of working multiple jobs to make ends meet, of sacrificing his own dreams to provide for his growing family. There were moments of joy, the birth of his children, small victories and celebrations, but they were overshadowed by the constant grind of financial hardship. "We never managed to get ahead," Frank admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Always thought there'd be time to save, to build something for ourselves. But life has a way of eating up your plans, doesn't it?" George nodded, thinking of his own struggles and setbacks over the years. But where he had eventually found success, Frank's story seemed to be one of endless uphill battles. As Frank continued, his voice grew more strained. He spoke of recent hardships, losing his job due to budget cuts and his age, the mounting medical bills as Helen's health declined, the painful distance that had grown between him and his children as they built their own lives. "I don't blame them," Frank said quickly, as if anticipating judgment. "They have their own families, their own struggles. I haven't told them how bad things have gotten. Don't want to be a burden, you know?" The weight of Frank's words hung heavy in the air. George found himself thinking of his own family, of the complex web of love, obligation, and unspoken tensions that defined their relationships. He wondered how many other Franks were out there, silently bearing their burdens, too proud or too afraid to reach out for help. As Frank's story wound to a close, ending with the heart-wrenching choice he had faced that very morning, medicine for Helen or food for himself, George felt a profound shift in his perspective. What had begun as a social experiment, a way to highlight society's indifference, had become a stark reminder of the very real struggles faced by so many. In Frank's tired eyes and trembling hands, in his quiet dignity and unwavering devotion to his wife, George saw a reflection of all that was both heartbreaking and inspiring about the human spirit. He realized that in trying to make a point about compassion, he had stumbled upon a story that demanded not just understanding, but action. As the last echoes of Frank's words faded, replaced by a heavy silence, George knew that his original plan no longer mattered. What mattered now was the man sitting before him, a lifetime of hopes and hardships etched into every line of his face. In that moment, as the afternoon sun slanted through the small window of the break room, casting long shadows across the floor, George made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The diner's main room seemed different somehow when George and Frank emerged from their conversation in the break room. The faded linoleum and chipped Formica countertops took on a new significance, each scuff and stain a testament to years of service, much like Frank himself. Frank moved towards the cleaning supplies, his movements slow but determined. "I should get back to work," he said, reaching for the mop handle. George placed a gentle hand on Frank's arm, stopping him. "Actually, Frank, I think we're done for the day." Confusion flickered across Frank's weathered features. "But I haven't finished. I still need to—" "You've done more than enough," George interrupted softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $2 bill, holding it out to Frank. Frank's eyes fixed on the money, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also a deep, aching sadness. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bill, the meager payment representing both a lifeline and a reminder of how far he had fallen. As Frank's fingers closed around the money, George felt a surge of emotion he hadn't anticipated. This moment, this simple transaction, suddenly seemed monumental in its implications. It represented everything that was wrong with a world that could reduce a man like Frank to accepting such a paltry sum for his labor. "Frank," George said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name, "there's something I need to tell you." Frank looked up, his brow furrowed in concern. "Is everything all right, Mr. George?" George took a deep breath, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. How could he explain the truth without seeming cruel? How could he reveal the nature of his experiment without diminishing the very real struggle Frank had endured? "The truth is, Frank, this wasn't just about cleaning the diner," George began hesitantly. I've been conducting a sort of social experiment. So I've been offering people this job, this ridiculously underpaid job, to see how they would react." Frank's expression shifted from confusion to something harder to read. "An experiment," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. George nodded, pushing on despite the growing knot in his stomach. "I wanted to see who would be desperate enough to accept such an unfair offer, to highlight how our society often ignores or takes advantage of those in need." As the words left his mouth, George realized how hollow they sounded. What had seemed like a noble idea that morning now felt painfully naive in the face of Frank's very real struggles. Frank stood silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I see," he said, "and I suppose I proved your point, didn't I?" The resignation in Frank's tone cut George to the quick. He had expected anger, perhaps, or at least indignation. But this quiet acceptance, this weary acknowledgement of a world that saw him as nothing more than a data point in someone else's social commentary, was far worse. "Frank, George began, but Frank held up a hand, stopping him. "It's all right, Mr. George. I understand. You're not the first person to see an old man like me and think they know my story." Frank's eyes met George's, and there was a depth of understanding there that made George feel small. "But let me ask you something. What did you learn from your experiment?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. George found himself at a loss for words, the carefully prepared conclusions he had imagined sharing on social media suddenly seeming trite and inadequate. "I learned," George said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that I had no idea what I was really looking for, that the world is far more complex and people's struggles far more profound than I could have imagined." Frank nodded, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a start," he said, "but what are you going to do with that knowledge?" It was a challenge, softly spoken but unmistakable. In that moment, George realized that the true experiment was only just beginning. The real test was not in exposing society's callousness, but in how he would respond to the very real need he had uncovered. "Frank," George said, his decision crystallizing even as he spoke, "I'd like to make you an offer, a real one this time." The late afternoon sun slanted through the diner's grimy windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. In the golden light, George and Frank faced each other, the air between them charged with an unexpected tension. Frank's eyebrows, knitted together, a mixture of wariness and curiosity etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "An offer," he repeated, his voice tinged with hesitation. "What kind of offer?" George took a deep breath, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. What he was about to propose would change both their lives irrevocably. It was impulsive, perhaps even reckless, but in his heart, he knew it was right. "I want you to run." "This place," George said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The diner, I want you to take it over." Frank's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he struggled to process George's words. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. I don't understand. You want me to what?" George gestured around. The diner, his movements animated by a growing excitement. "This place, Frank, I want you to run it, to make it your own. I've been thinking of selling for a while now, but I never found the right person. Until today." Frank shook his head, disbelief evident in every line of his body. But why? You don't even know me, and I don't have any money to buy a business." "You don't need money," George said firmly. "What you have is far more valuable: experience, work ethic, and a need that this place can fill." As George continued to explain his idea, outlining a plan where Frank would take over operations with the option to buy the diner over time, he watched a transformation take place in the older man. The defeated slump of Frank's shoulders began to straighten, and a spark of something long dormant flickered to life in his tired eyes. "But what about you?" Frank asked, his voice stronger now, tinged with a cautious hope. "This is your livelihood, your dream." George smiled, a bittersweet twinge in his chest. "It was my father's dream," he corrected gently. "I inherited this place, but my heart's never really been in it. I've been looking for a way out that wouldn't let him down, and now I think I've found it." As the reality of the offer began to sink in, Frank's composure cracked. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over to trace paths down his cheeks. I don't know what to say," he choked out. It's too much." George placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, squeezing gently. "It's not charity, Frank, it's an opportunity, for both of us. You need a fresh start, and this place needs someone who understands the value of hard work and perseverance. Someone like you." For a long moment, Frank stood silent, his gaze roaming over the diner as if seeing it for the first time. George could almost see the wheels turning in the older man's mind, years of crushed dreams and deferred hopes slowly giving way to the possibility of a new beginning. Finally, Frank turned back to George, his eyes shining with a mixture of tears and newfound determination. "If you're sure about this," he said, his voice steadier now, "then I accept. I'll pour everything I have into making this place a success." The two men shook hands, the simple gesture sealing a pact that went far beyond a mere business transaction. It was a commitment to second chances, to the power of compassion, and to the enduring strength of the human spirit. As they began to discuss the details of the arrangement, George felt a weight lift from his shoulders. What had begun as a misguided attempt to prove a point about society's indifference had transformed into something far more meaningful. In trying to expose the worst of humanity, he had stumbled upon its best: resilience, dignity, and the capacity for kindness in the face of adversity. Outside the diner, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the small miracle unfolding within the faded walls of George's establishment. But for the two men inside, the world had shifted on its axis, opening up a future bright with newfound hope and possibility. The news of Frank's sudden change in fortune spread quickly through his small, tight-knit community. What began as hushed whispers of disbelief soon blossomed into a swell of support and excitement. The story of the elderly janitor who had been given a second chance at life struck a chord with many, igniting a spark of hope in hearts long accustomed to hardship. For Frank, the days following George's offer were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Each morning he would wake before dawn, his body aching but his spirit buoyed by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He would kiss Helen's forehead, gently, careful not to wake her, and make his way to the diner, eager to learn every aspect of the business he would soon call his own. George proved to be a patient teacher, guiding Frank through the intricacies of running a small restaurant. They spent long hours poring over ledgers, discussing menu options, and strategizing ways to breathe new life into the aging establishment. Frank absorbed it all with the hunger of a man who had been given a feast after years of famine. But it wasn't just Frank who was changing. The diner itself seemed to come alive under his care. The floors gleamed as they hadn't in years. The windows sparkled, and even the old neon sign out front buzzed with renewed vigor. Frank's attention to detail and unwavering work ethic began to attract notice, drawing in curious locals and breathing new life into the once struggling business. One crisp morning, as Frank was wiping down the counter, the bell above the door chimed. He looked up to see a young woman enter, her eyes darting around the diner with obvious curiosity. "Good morning," Frank greeted her warmly. "What can I get for you today?" The woman approached the counter, a hesitant smile on her face. "Actually," she said, "I'm here about a job I heard you might be hiring." Frank blinked in surprise. It was true that he and George had discussed the need for additional help, but they hadn't even put out an advertisement yet. "Word travels fast in this neighborhood," the woman explained, noticing Frank's confusion. "My name's Sarah. I live just down the block and, well, I've been looking for work for a while now. When I heard about what happened to you, about this place, I thought maybe there might be an opportunity here." As Frank listened to Sarah's story, a single mother struggling to make ends meet, bouncing from one underpaid job to another, he felt a deep resonance with his own experiences. Here was someone else who had been overlooked, undervalued, and yet refused to give up. "You know," Frank said slowly, a plan forming in his mind, "we could use some help around here. Why don't you come back tomorrow morning? We'll give it a try and see how it goes." The gratitude that bloomed on Sarah's face was a mirror of Frank's own feelings just days before. As she left the diner, a spring in her step, Frank felt a warmth spread through his chest. He was passing on the kindness that George had shown him, creating a ripple effect of hope and opportunity. That evening, as Frank recounted the day's events to Helen, he noticed a change in his wife's demeanor. The worry lines that had become a permanent fixture on her face seemed to soften, and there was a light in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "Oh, Frank," Helen said, reaching out to clasp his hand, "I'm so proud of you. You've always had such a big heart. And now you have the chance to really make a difference." Frank squeezed her hand gently, his throat tight with emotion. "We're making a difference," he corrected her. "I couldn't do any of this without you, my love." As they sat together in their small living room, discussing plans for the diner and daring to dream of a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility, Frank marveled at how quickly life could change. Just a week ago, he had been on the brink of despair, seeing no way out of the cycle of poverty and hardship that had defined his later years. Now he was not only finding his own path to a better life, but also opening doors for others in his community. The diner was becoming more than just a business. It was transforming into a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As Frank drifted off to sleep that night, his mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for George's kindness, for Helen's unwavering support, and for the chance to prove that it's never too late for a new beginning. The journey ahead would not be easy, he knew, but for the first time in years, Frank faced the future, not with dread, but with eager anticipation. Little did Frank know that the true test of his newfound purpose was yet to come, and that the ripples of change he had set in motion were about to encounter their first significant obstacle. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky when Frank arrived at the diner, a spring in his step despite the early hour. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity and positive change. The diner was slowly but steadily gaining a reputation as a warm, welcoming space where good food was served with genuine care. Sarah had proven to be an excellent addition to the team, her cheerful demeanor and quick learning complementing Frank's experience and dedication. Together, they had begun to build something special, a place where regulars felt like family and newcomers were greeted with open arms. As Frank unlocked the front door, humming softly to himself, he noticed something amiss. A large envelope had been shoved under the door, its official-looking seal standing out starkly against the worn welcome mat. With a furrowed brow, Frank bent to retrieve it, a vague sense of unease settling in his stomach. Inside the diner, Frank settled into his usual morning routine, but his movements were distracted, his mind continually drawn to the unopened envelope sitting on the counter. Finally, unable to focus on anything else, he sat down and carefully opened the mysterious missive. As he read the contents, Frank felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The letter was from the city's health department, detailing a list of code violations that needed to be addressed immediately. Outdated wiring, a malfunctioning ventilation system, structural issues with the building itself. The list seemed endless, each item carrying a hefty price tag for repair. Frank's hands trembled as he set the letter down, his mind reeling. The repairs would cost far more than the diner's modest profits could cover. Even with the savings he and Helen had managed to scrape together, it wouldn't be nearly enough. The dream that had begun to take root, the hope that had blossomed so beautifully, now seemed on the verge of withering before it could truly flourish. The bell above the door chimed, startling Frank from his reverie. He looked up to see George entering, a smile on his face that quickly faded as he took in Frank's devastated expression. "Frank, what's wrong?" George asked, rushing to the counter. Wordlessly, Frank handed over the letter. As George read, his face grew grave. "Oh, Frank," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea the building had fallen into such disrepair. I should have been more diligent." Frank shook his head, cutting off George's self-recrimination. "It's not your fault, George. These things happen, but what are we going to do? I don't have this kind of money, and even if I did, the deadline they've given us is impossible to meet." George's brow furrowed in concentration as he reread the letter. "Maybe we can appeal, buy some more time, or look into small business loans." As the two men discussed potential solutions, each idea seeming more far-fetched than the last, Sarah arrived for her shift. Sensing the tension in the air, she approached cautiously. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her eyes darting between Frank and George. Frank hesitated, not wanting to burden the young woman with their troubles, but as he looked at Sarah's concerned face, he realized that she deserved to know. This affected her future, too. With a heavy heart, Frank explained the situation. Sarah listened intently, her initial shock giving way to a determined expression. "We can't give up," she said firmly. "This place means too much to all of us, to the whole neighborhood. There has to be a way." Her words, spoken with such conviction, sparked something in Frank. He thought of Helen, of how her face had lit up when he told her about the diner, of the regulars who had come to depend on this place for more than just a meal. He thought of George's trust in him, and of Sarah's unwavering belief in their shared dream. "You're right," Frank said, straightening his shoulders. "We can't give up, not without a fight." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Between serving customers, Frank, George, and Sarah brainstormed ideas, made phone calls, and researched every possible avenue for assistance. They reached out to local business associations, explored crowdfunding options, and even considered approaching some of their more well-off regulars for help. As closing time approached, they had a list of potential solutions, but none that could fully address the magnitude of their problem. The mood was somber as they cleaned up, the weight of uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. Just as Frank was about to lock up, the bell chimed once more. He turned to see a group of people entering, regulars, neighbors, even a few faces he didn't recognize. At the front of the group was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had been coming to the diner every morning for years. "Frank," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice warm but firm, "we heard about what's happening and we're here to help." Frank blinked in surprise, looking from Mrs. Rodriguez to the crowd behind her. I don't understand," he stammered. A man Frank, recognized as the owner of the hardware store down the street, stepped forward. "This place, what you're doing here, it matters to all of us," he said. "We've been talking and we want to pitch in. Some of us can donate materials for the repairs, others can offer labor. It won't solve everything, but it's a start." Tears welled up in Frank's eyes as person after person came forward, offering what they could. Some promised financial contributions, Others volunteered their time and skills. Even those who had little to give pledged to spread the word, to bring in more customers and support. As Frank looked around at the faces of his neighbors, all united in their determination to save the diner, he felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This was more than just about a business. It was about community, about the connections forged over countless cups of coffee and shared meals. George, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing amazement, cleared his throat. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that we've all underestimated the power of what's been built here. This isn't just Frank's diner anymore. It belongs to all of us." As the impromptu meeting continued late into the night, plans were made, tasks assigned, and hope rekindled. The challenge ahead was still daunting, but Frank no longer felt alone in facing it. He had an entire community standing beside him, ready to fight for the place that had come to mean so much to them all. When Frank finally made it home that night, exhausted but exhilarated, he found Helen waiting up for him. As he recounted the events of the day, ending with the unexpected outpouring of support, Helen's eyes shone with pride and love. "You see, Frank," she said softly, taking his hand in hers, "this is what happens when you open your heart to others. They open theirs, right back." As Frank drifted off to sleep that night, his mind was filled not with worry but with gratitude and determination. The road ahead would be difficult, but with the strength of his community behind him, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The unexpected turn his life had taken had led him not just to a new business but to a renewed sense of purpose and belonging. Little did Frank know that this challenge was just the beginning, and that the true test of his resilience and the strength of his newfound community was yet to come. The following weeks saw a flurry of activity at the diner. What had once been a quiet neighborhood eatery transformed into a bustling hub of community effort. Each day brought new faces, all eager to lend a hand in saving the beloved establishment. Frank found himself at the center of it all, coordinating volunteers, managing donations, and overseeing the myriad repairs that needed to be done. It was exhausting work, but exhilarating too. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, his purpose clear and his spirit invigorated. The hardware store owner, Mr. Jenkins, true to his word, arrived with a truck full of materials, paint, lumber, and tools. He refused any payment, insisting that the diner's famous apple pie was compensation enough. "Just make sure you don't change that recipe," he said with a wink. "It's the only thing keeping my wife sweet on me after all these years." Sarah proved to be an unexpected asset during the renovation. Her natural organizational skills came to the fore as she created schedules, managed inventory, and kept everyone on task. She seemed to thrive in the chaos, her confidence growing with each problem solved and each hurdle overcome. Even George, who had initially stepped back to let Frank take the lead, found himself drawn into the project. His business acumen proved invaluable as they navigated the complexities of permits and inspections. More than once, his calm demeanor and diplomatic skills smoothed over potential conflicts with city officials. As the days passed, the diner began to transform. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new wiring hummed quietly behind them, and the kitchen gleamed with updated equipment. But it wasn't just the physical space that was changing. The spirit of the place, the very air within it, seemed charged with a new energy. One afternoon, as Frank took a rare moment to catch his breath, he found himself standing next to Mrs. Rodriguez. The elderly woman surveyed the busy scene before them, a knowing smile on her face. "You know, Frank," she said, softly, "I've been coming to this diner for over 40 years. I've seen it change hands, seen good times and bad, but I've never seen anything quite like this." Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It's amazing," he agreed. "I never imagined—" Mrs. Rodriguez patted his arm gently. "This is what community is all about, dear. We take care of our own. And you, with your kindness and your hard work, you've reminded us all of that." As Frank pondered her words, he caught sight of Sarah across the room. She was laughing with a group of volunteers, her face alight with joy. It struck him then how much she had changed in the short time she'd been working at the diner. Gone was the hesitant, worried young woman who had first come looking for a job. In her place stood a confident, capable leader. Frank's reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face, his neighbor, Tom. Tom had always been a bit of a recluse, rarely seen outside his home. Yet here he was, paintbrush in hand, ready to help. "Tom," Frank said, unable to hide his surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here." Tom shrugged, a sheepish smile on his face. "Well, I figured it was about time I did something for the neighborhood. This place, it matters, you know, even to folks like me who don't get out much." As Frank watched Tom integrate himself into a group of painters, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was more than just saving a business. They were rebuilding connections, strengthening the bonds that held their community together. That evening, as the last of the volunteers filed out, Frank found himself alone in the diner. The place was still a work in progress, drop cloths covering half-finished projects and the air thick with the scent of fresh paint and sawdust. But already, he could see glimpses of what it would become. He ran his hand along the newly installed counter, marveling at its smooth surface. This was where he would serve countless cups of coffee, where neighbors would gather to share their days. Over there, by the window, families would create memories over shared meals. And in the kitchen, he would pour his heart into every dish, honoring the trust his community had placed in him. As Frank locked up and headed home, his body ached from the long days of work, but his heart was light. He couldn't wait to share the day's progress with Helen, to see her eyes light up as she imagined the renewed diner. What Frank didn't realize was that while he had been so focused on rebuilding the diner, life had been preparing another challenge. One that would test not just his resilience, but the very foundations of the community that had come together to support him. The morning dawned grey and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the news that awaited Frank as he arrived at the diner. A small group had already gathered outside, their faces grim. At the center stood George, holding a sodden piece of paper in his hands. "What's going on?" Frank asked, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. George looked up, his eyes filled, with a mixture of anger and defeat. "The building next door," he said, his voice tight. "It caught fire last night. The water damage. Frank, it's bad." Frank pushed past the group, his heart pounding. As he rounded the corner, he saw the extent of the damage. The neighboring building was a charred husk, and water from the firefighters' hoses had seeped through the shared wall. The diner's newly painted walls were stained and bubbling, and puddles of dirty water covered the floor they had so painstakingly refinished just days ago. For a moment, Frank stood frozen, unable to process the scene before him. All their hard work, all the community's efforts, seemed to have been washed away in a single night. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah, her eyes wide with concern. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." Her words seemed to break the spell. Frank straightened his shoulders, taking a deep breath. "Well," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I suppose we'd better get to work then." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Volunteers arrived in droves, armed with mops, buckets, and determination. The community that had come together to renovate the diner now rallied to save it from this new threat. As they worked, Frank couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. Rumors were flying about the cause of the fire, about potential arson and real estate developers eyeing the block. He tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand, but a nagging worry persisted. By mid-afternoon, they had made significant progress in cleaning up the water damage, but the extent of the destruction was becoming clear. Much of their previous work would need to be redone, and there were new issues to contend with: potential mold, structural damage to the shared wall, and the lingering smell of smoke that seemed to permeate everything. As Frank surveyed the scene, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he found George standing beside him, a worried frown on his face. "Frank," George said softly, "maybe it's time to consider other options. It might be too much." Frank felt a flare of anger at the suggestion, but as he looked into George's eyes, he saw only genuine concern. "What are you saying, George?" he asked, his voice low. George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm saying that sometimes knowing when to walk away is just as important as knowing when to fight." You've done amazing things here, Frank. But this might be a sign that it's time to let go. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Let go? After everything they'd been through, everything the community had done. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he didn't have the energy. Instead, he simply shook his head. I can't, George, he said quietly. I can't give up. Not now. George nodded, a sad smile on his face. I thought you might say that. Just promise me you'll think about it, okay? Really think about what's best for you and Helen. As George walked away, Frank felt the weight of his words settle on his shoulders. He thought of Helen, waiting. At home, always supportive, but increasingly worried about the toll this was taking on him. He thought of Sarah and the other employees, whose livelihoods now depended on the diner's success. And he thought of the community that had rallied around them, pouring their time, resources, and hope into this place. The sound of laughter drew Frank's attention. He looked up to see a group of volunteers taking a break, sharing stories and jokes as they rested from their labors. Despite the circumstances, there was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose that filled the air. In that moment, Frank realized that George was both right and wrong. This was about more than just a business now. It was about the connections forged, the community strengthened, the hope rekindled. Walking away might be the easy choice, but it wasn't the right one. With renewed determination, Frank pushed himself off the counter and rejoined the cleanup efforts. As he worked alongside his neighbors and friends, he began to formulate a plan. They had overcome obstacles before, and they would do so again. Somehow, some way, they would find a path forward. What Frank didn't know was that the true test of his resolve and of the community's unity was yet to come. The rumors of arson and development were not just idle gossip, and forces beyond their control were already in motion, threatening not just the diner, but the very fabric of the neighborhood they all called home. As the days turned into weeks, the diner slowly began to recover from the devastating setback. The water damage was repaired, walls were repainted, and slowly but surely, the warm, inviting atmosphere that had become the diner's hallmark began to re-emerge. Frank threw himself into the work with renewed vigor, often arriving before dawn and staying long after the last customer had left. His determination was infectious, inspiring those around him to push harder, to give more. But the toll of his relentless pace was beginning to show. One morning, as Frank was preparing for the day ahead, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest. He gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady himself as the room seemed to spin around him. Sarah, who had just arrived for her shift, rushed to his side. "Frank, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Frank tried to wave her off, to insist he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The pain intensified, and he felt his knees buckle. The last thing he heard before darkness overtook him was Sarah's panicked voice calling for help. When Frank regained consciousness, he found himself in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. Helen sat beside him, her face etched with worry. As his eyes fluttered open, she leaned forward, grasping his hand tightly. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave us quite a scare." Frank tried to sit up, but Helen gently pushed him back. "The doctor said you need to rest," she said firmly. "You've had a mild heart attack, love. Your body is telling you to slow down." Frank felt a wave of frustration wash over him. How could he slow down now, when there was still so much to do? But as he looked into Helen's eyes, saw the fear and love there, he realized he had no choice. He had to find a way to balance his passion for the diner with his own well-being and his responsibilities to his family. Over the next few days, as Frank recovered in the hospital, he had a lot of time to think. He reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, on the unexpected twists and turns that had led him from despair to hope and back again, and he thought about the community that had rallied around him, the people who had become more than just neighbors or customers. They had become family. Visitors streamed in and out of his hospital room: George, Sarah, Mrs. Rodriguez, and countless others. Each brought not just well wishes but updates on the diner. They assured him that everything was being taken care of, that he should focus on getting better. It was during one of these visits, as Frank listened to Mr. Jenkins enthusiastically describe the new shelving he was installing in the diner's storage room, that an idea began to form. He had been trying to do too much on his own, carrying the weight of the diner's success solely on his shoulders. But that wasn't what had made the place special. It was the collective effort, the shared investment of the entire community that had breathed new life into the old establishment. When Frank was finally released from the hospital, he returned to the diner with a new perspective. He gathered his staff and the core group of volunteers who had been instrumental in the renovation efforts. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice still a bit weak but filled with conviction. "This place, it's become more than just a diner. It's the heart of our community, and I think it's time we made that official." Over the next hour, Frank outlined his vision. The diner would become a cooperative, owned and operated by the community itself. Those who had invested their time and resources would have the opportunity to become shareholders. Major decisions would be made collectively, ensuring that the diner truly served the needs and desires of the neighborhood. The room buzzed with excitement as people began to discuss the possibilities. Sarah's eyes shone as she suggested expanding their youth employment program. Mr. Jenkins proposed using the space for community events and classes during off hours. Mrs. Rodriguez, with a sly smile, volunteered to teach a cooking class, promising to finally reveal the secret to her famous empanadas. As the ideas flowed, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was what he had envisioned from the start, even if he hadn't realized it. A place that belonged to everyone, where the entire community could come together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. George, who had been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke up. "Frank," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think you've stumbled onto something truly special here. This isn't just about saving a diner anymore. It's about rebuilding a community." Frank nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's about giving people a chance," he said softly, thinking of his own journey from despair to hope. "A chance to belong, to contribute, to make a difference." As the meeting continued late into the night, plans were made and roles assigned. The energy in the room was palpable, a sense of shared purpose and excitement that seemed to make the very air crackle with possibility. When Frank finally made it home that night, exhausted but exhilarated, he found Helen waiting up for him. As he recounted the events of the evening, her eyes grew wide with wonder and pride. "Oh, Frank," she said, taking his hand in hers, "you've done something truly remarkable. You've given people hope." Frank squeezed her hand gently, feeling a surge of love and gratitude. "We've done it together," he corrected her. "All of us, and we're just getting started." As he drifted off to sleep that night, Frank's mind was filled not with worries about finances or repairs, but with visions of the future. He saw the diner bustling with activity, a true hub of community life. He imagined young people learning valuable skills, elderly neighbors finding companionship, and families coming together over shared meals. But even as these pleasant thoughts swirled in his mind, a small part of him remained alert to the challenges that still lay ahead. The rumors of development and potential threats to the neighborhood hadn't gone away, and transforming the diner into a cooperative would bring its own set of complexities and potential conflicts. Yet Frank felt ready to face whatever came next. He was no longer alone in this journey. He had a community behind him, a shared vision to guide them, and a renewed sense of purpose that burned brighter than ever. Little did Frank know that the true test of this new model and of the community's resolve was just around the corner. Forces beyond their control were already in motion, threatening not just the diner, but the very fabric of the neighborhood they all called home. The transformation of the diner into a community cooperative brought a new energy to the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and soon people from all over the city were coming to see the little eatery that had become a symbol of grassroots empowerment. Frank, still recovering from his health scare, found himself in a new role as mentor and advisor. He watched with pride as Sarah took on more responsibilities, her natural leadership skills blossoming in the collaborative environment. The diner hummed with activity, not just during mealtimes, but throughout the day and into the evening as various community programs and classes took shape. But even as the diner thrived, Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The first signs of trouble came in the form of a sleek black car that began appearing on their street with increasing frequency. Men in expensive suits would emerge, speaking in hushed tones as they surveyed the surrounding buildings. It was Mrs. Rodriguez who first brought it to Frank's attention. "Something's not right," she said one afternoon, her usually cheerful face creased with worry. "I've seen those men before, back when they were trying to buy up half the block for that big mall project a few years ago." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard rumors of developers eyeing the neighborhood, but he had been so focused on the diner that he hadn't paid them much mind. Now he realized they might be facing a threat far greater than fire or flood. His suspicions were confirmed a few days later when George burst into the diner, waving a handful of papers. "They're trying to force us out," he said, his face flushed with anger. "Emerald Development Corporation. They've bought up most of the block already, and now they're pressuring the holdouts to sell." Frank scanned the documents George had brought, his heart sinking. The development plan was ambitious, a large-scale retail and residential complex that would completely reshape the neighborhood. And right in the center of it all, where the diner now stood, was a proposed parking structure. "But they can't just make us leave, can they?" Sarah asked, her voice small and uncertain. George shook his head grimly. "Not directly, no. But they have ways of making life difficult. Increased property taxes, manipulated zoning laws, even eminent domain if they can convince the city it's for the greater good." The news spread quickly through the diner, casting a pall over the once vibrant atmosphere. Frank watched as fear and uncertainty began to take hold, threatening to unravel all they had built together. That evening, after closing, Frank called an emergency meeting of the diner's core team. As they gathered around the largest table, the mood was somber. Frank looked at each face in turn. George, with his wealth of business experience; Sarah, young and idealistic but fiercely determined; Mrs. Rodriguez, a pillar of the community; Mr. Jenkins, practical and steadfast. These were the people who had stood by him from the beginning, who had believed in the vision of what the diner could become. "We knew this day might come," Frank began, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "We've always known that what we're doing here is about more than just running a restaurant. It's about preserving the heart and soul of this community." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Now we're facing our biggest challenge yet, this development. It threatens everything we've built, not just the diner, but the very fabric of our neighborhood." The room was silent as the weight of his words sank in. Then slowly voices began to rise. Ideas were proposed, debated, discarded, and refined. As the night wore on, a plan began to take shape, a plan that would require every ounce of their collective creativity, determination, and community spirit. They would fight back, not with the weapons of corporate warfare, but with the tools they knew best: compassion, solidarity, and the power of a united community. They would tell their story, rally support from across the city, and show the world that there was value in preserving neighborhoods like theirs, value that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. As the meeting finally broke up in the early hours of the morning, Frank felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The road ahead would be difficult, perhaps the most challenging they had faced yet. But looking at the determined faces of his friends and neighbors, he felt a surge of hope. This was more than just a battle for a building or a business. It was a fight for the soul of their community, for the idea that ordinary people could come together and create something extraordinary. And Frank knew with a certainty that ran bone deep that it was a fight worth having. As he locked up the diner and headed home, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. Frank paused for a moment, looking up at the fading stars. He thought of Helen, waiting for him at home, always his rock and his comfort. He thought of the long journey that had brought him to this point, the twists and turns of fate that had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. And he thought of the battles yet to come, the challenges they would face in the days and weeks ahead. But even as worry gnawed at the edges of his mind, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened, they would face it together, and in that unity, in the bonds of community and shared purpose, lay their greatest strength. Little Did Frank know that the true test of those bonds was yet to come, as forces beyond their control conspired to tear apart the very fabric of the community they had worked so hard to weave together? The following weeks saw the diner transform once again, this time into the headquarters of a grassroots movement. The walls, once adorned with local artwork and community announcements, now held maps of the neighborhood, lists of city council members and strategies for community organizing. Frank, despite his doctor's warnings to take it easy, found himself at the center of it all. His quiet determination and unwavering belief in their cause inspired those around him, galvanizing the community into action. Sarah proved to be a natural organizer, coordinating volunteers and managing their social media presence with a skill that belied her years. Mr. Jenkins put his connections in the local business community to good use, rallying support from other small business owners who feared the impact of the proposed development. Mrs. Rodriguez became the heart of their campaign, her warm personality and gift for storytelling helping to personalize the impact of the potential loss of their neighborhood. She organized story nights at the diner, where longtime residents shared memories, and newcomers spoke of the sense of belonging they had found in this tight-knit community. George, meanwhile, dove into the legal and bureaucratic aspects of their fight. He pored over zoning laws, attended city council meetings, and worked tirelessly to find any leverage they could use against Emerald Development Corporation. As news of their struggle spread, support began pouring in from across the city. Other neighborhoods facing similar pressures reached out, forming a network of mutual aid and shared resources. Local artists and musicians organized benefit concerts. Even a few sympathetic city officials began quietly providing insider information and advice. But for every step forward, it seemed Emerald Development pushed back twice as hard. Pressure on holdout property owners intensified. Rumors circulated about potential health code violations at the diner, leading to a series of surprise inspections that disrupted their business and strained their resources. The stress began to take its toll on everyone, but perhaps most visibly on Frank. Despite his best efforts to delegate and pace himself, the constant battles left him looking increasingly worn. Helen watched him with growing concern, torn between her support for the cause and her fear for her husband's health. It all came to a head on a crisp autumn evening, as Frank was locking up after another long strategy session. He felt a now familiar tightness in his chest and leaned against the diner's wall, trying to catch his breath. That's when he noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, and the man in the expensive suit approaching him. "Mr. Frank Thompson?" the man asked, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm David Ellison, CEO of Emerald Development. I think it's time we had a chat." Frank straightened up, fighting against the pain and fatigue. "I'm listening," he said cautiously. Ellison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've put up quite a fight, Mr. Thompson. I respect that, but surely you must see that you're fighting a losing battle. Why don't we discuss how we can make this transition easier for everyone?" As Ellison spoke, laying out offers of compensation and promises of job opportunities in the new development, Frank felt a strange calm settle over him. He looked past Ellison, taking in the street he had come to know so well. He saw the faded awnings of Mr. Lee's grocery store, where 3 generations had served the community. He saw the small park where neighborhood kids played under the watchful eyes of elderly residents. And he saw the diner, its windows warm with light, people inside still working, planning, hoping. "Mr. Ellison," Frank said, cutting off the CEO's practiced pitch. "I appreciate you coming down here yourself, but I'm afraid you've misunderstood something fundamental about our situation." Ellison's smile faltered slightly. "Oh? And what's that?" Frank gestured to the street around them. "This isn't just real estate to us, this is our home. These aren't just buildings, they're the physical embodiment of decades of shared history, of communities forged through good times and bad. You're not offering us a fair deal for property. You're asking us to sell our hearts and souls." He paused, looking Ellison directly in the eye. "And those, Mr. Ellison, are not for sale, at any price." For a moment, Ellison seemed taken aback. Then, his face hardened. "That's a shame, Mr. Thompson. I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. But make no mistake, this development will happen, with or without your cooperation. As Ellison turned and walked back to his car, Frank felt the weight of his words settle on his shoulders. He knew that this confrontation marked a turning point. The battle lines had been drawn, and the true fight was just beginning. Frank watched the black car drive away, his mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. As he turned to go back into the diner, he stumbled slightly, the pain in his chest flaring again. But this time it was accompanied by a steely resolve. They had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. Whatever Emerald development threw at them next, they would face it together. The heart of their community was at stake, and Frank was determined to show Ellison and his corporation that some things truly were beyond price. As he pushed open the diner door, greeted by the concerned faces of his friends and neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation, Frank knew that the greatest challenge of their struggle lay ahead. But looking at the determined faces around him, he also knew that they had never been more ready to face it. The confrontation with David Ellison marked a new phase in the battle for the neighborhood. Emerald development, realizing that their usual tactics of pressure and persuasion had failed, began to escalate their efforts. The community found itself facing a barrage of legal challenges, negative press, and increasingly aggressive buyout attempts. Frank and his team worked tirelessly to counter each move. They organized rallies, launched a media campaign to tell their story, and even managed to get a local filmmaker interested in documenting their struggle. The diner became more than just a meeting place. It was the symbol of their resistance, a beacon of hope for communities facing similar battles across the city. But the constant stress and late nights were taking their toll, especially on Frank. Despite Helen's pleas and his doctor's warnings, he pushed himself to the limit, driven by the fear that if he slowed down, even for a moment, everything they had fought for would crumble. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning, as Frank was preparing to speak at a crucial city council meeting, that his body finally rebelled. As he stood at the podium, notes in hand, the room began to spin. He gripped the edges of the lectern, trying to steady himself, but the words on the page blurred before his eyes. The last thing Frank heard before collapsing was Sarah's panicked voice calling his name. He awoke in the hospital, the steady beep of monitors a familiar and unwelcome sound. Helen sat beside him, her face etched with worry and a hint of anger. "You promised me you'd take it easy," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. Frank tried to sit up, but Helen gently pushed him back. "The doctor says you need to rest," she said firmly. "No arguments this time, Frank. You've pushed yourself too hard for too long." As the reality of his situation sank in, Frank felt a wave of despair wash over him. How could he rest when there was still so much to do? The city council meeting had been their best chance to block the development. Without his testimony, his thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Suddenly the door burst open, and Sarah rushed in, followed by George, Mrs. Rodriguez, and what seemed like half the neighborhood. "Frank!" Sarah exclaimed, her face flushed with excitement. "You won't believe what happened." Over the next few minutes, as his friends talked over each other in their eagerness to share the news, Frank learned that something remarkable had occurred at the city council meeting. In his absence, Sarah had stepped up to speak. Her impassioned plea, born from months of working alongside Frank and absorbing his vision for the community, had moved the council in a way no rehearsed speech could have. But it wasn't just Sarah. One by one, community members had stood up to share their stories. Mr. Lee spoke of his family's 3 generations of serving the neighborhood. A young mother told of how the diner's youth program had turned her teenage son's life around. Even Mr. Jenkins, usually so reserved, gave a stirring account of how the fight to save the neighborhood had renewed his faith in community spirit. The result? The city council had voted to temporarily halt all development plans and to create a task force to study the impact of large-scale developments on established communities. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a crucial reprieve, a chance to gather their strength and build an even stronger case. As Frank listened, tears welling in his eyes, he felt a profound shift within himself. He had been so focused on leading the charge, on shouldering the burden of their struggle, that he had forgotten the most important lesson of all. The true strength of a community lies not in any one individual, but in the collective spirit of its people. He looked around the hospital room, at the faces of his friends and neighbors, all beaming with a mixture of pride and concern for his well-being. In that moment, Frank realized that his greatest contribution to their cause might not be in what he could do, but in what he could inspire others to do. "I'm so proud of all of you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You've shown that this fight isn't about me or any one person. It's about all of us, working together to protect what matters most." Sarah stepped forward, taking Frank's hand. "We couldn't have done it without you, Frank," she said softly. "You showed us what was possible. Now it's our turn to carry that vision forward." As the group continued to share details of the council, meeting and their plans for the next phase of their campaign, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been carrying the burden of leadership for so long, afraid that if he faltered, everything would fall apart. But here was proof that the community he had helped to nurture was strong enough to stand on its own. So over the next few weeks, as Frank recovered in the hospital and then at home under Helen's watchful care, he watched with pride as the community continued to rally and organize. Sarah had stepped into a leadership role with grace and determination, her youthful energy balanced by the wisdom and experience of George, Mrs. Rodriguez, and the other longtime residents. The diner, still the heart of their movement, buzzed with activity. Strategy meetings, community outreach programs, and fundraising events filled the calendar. But there was also a renewed focus on what had made the place special to begin with: good food, warm company, and a sense of belonging. As Frank's strength gradually returned, he found himself settling into a new role. Rather than being at the forefront of every initiative, he became a mentor and advisor, sharing his experience and insights but trusting others to take the lead. He discovered that this new position allowed him to see the bigger picture more clearly, to offer guidance that came from a place of reflection rather than reaction. One sunny afternoon, about a month after his collapse, Frank made his way back to the diner for the first time since his hospitalization. As he pushed open the door, the familiar bell chiming above him, he was greeted by a chorus of cheers and applause. The diner was packed with familiar faces, all there to welcome him back. Sarah rushed forward to give him a hug. "Welcome home, Frank," she said, her eyes shining. As Frank looked around at the smiling faces, the walls covered with plans and posters, the tables filled with people sharing meals and ideas, he felt a swell of emotion. This was more than he could have ever dreamed of when he first accepted George's offer all those months ago. He raised his hands and the room fell quiet. "Thank you all," he said, his voice strong despite the tears in his eyes. "Looking around this room, seeing all of you here, I realized something important. We've been talking about saving our neighborhood, about preserving what we have, but the truth is we've already built something new and wonderful. Whatever happens with the developers, whatever challenges we face next, we've proven that when we come together we can create something truly special." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Frank continued, "I may have helped start this journey, but it's all of you who have turned it into something amazing. This isn't my fight anymore, it's ours, and together I believe there's nothing we can't accomplish." As the room erupted in cheers and applause, Frank felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had found his place not as a savior or a leader, but as part of something greater than himself. The future was still uncertain, the battle with Emerald Development far from over, but in this moment, surrounded by the warmth and solidarity of his community, Frank knew that they were ready for whatever came next. The story of the diner and the neighborhood it had helped to transform was far from over, but as Frank took his seat at the counter, accepting a cup of coffee from a beaming Mrs. Rodriguez, he knew that the most important chapters had already been written, not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the countless small acts of kindness, courage, and community that had brought them all to this point. The bell above the door chimed again as new customers entered, and Frank smiled. The work continued, the story evolved, but the heart of what they had built remained strong. And in that strength, in the bonds forged through struggle and triumph, lay the true victory they had all been fighting for. As the seasons changed and winter gave way to spring, the neighborhood found itself in a state of cautious optimism. The battle with Emerald Development was far from over, but the community had proven its resilience time and time again. The task force created by the City Council had been diligently working, gathering data and testimonies from residents across the city. Their preliminary findings suggested that the impact of large-scale developments on established communities was far more complex and potentially detrimental than previously acknowledged. This gave Frank and his neighbors hope that their struggle might lead to lasting change, not just for their own neighborhood, but for others facing similar challenges. On a bright Saturday morning, the diner was bustling with its usual weekend crowd. Frank, now fully recovered and embracing his role as mentor and community elder, sat at his favorite spot at the counter, chatting with customers and offering advice to the young staff members Sarah had brought on board. As he sipped his coffee, Frank's gaze wandered around the room, taking in the sights that had become so familiar, yet never failed to warm his heart. In one corner, Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching a group of children how to make her famous empanadas, their laughter filling the air with joy. At a nearby table, Mr. Jenkins was deep in conversation with a young entrepreneur, offering guidance on how to start a small business. The bell above the door chimed and Frank turned to see George enter, a broad smile on his face and a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Frank," he called out, making his way to the counter, "have you seen the news?" Frank shook his head, accepting the paper George thrust towards him. The headline made his heart skip a beat. City Council proposes new regulations on large-scale urban development. As Frank quickly scanned the article, his eyes widening with each paragraph, George could barely contain his excitement. "They're citing our neighborhood as a case study," he explained. "The task force's recommendations. Frank, they're talking about mandatory community impact assessments, requirements for affordable housing allocation, preservation of historic areas. This could change everything." Frank set the paper down, feeling a mix of emotions wash over him, pride in what they had accomplished, hope for the future, and a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. "It's not a complete victory," Frank said cautiously, ever the realist. "Emerald Development and companies like them won't give up easily. There will be legal challenges, lobbying efforts." George nodded, his expression growing serious. "You're right, of course, but think about where we were a year ago, Frank. Think about how far we've come. This isn't just about stopping one development anymore. We've started a conversation that's echoing across the city." As if to underscore George's point, Sarah approached, tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her eyes shining with excitement, "but you've got to see this. We're trending on social media. People from all over the country are sharing our story, asking how they can start similar initiatives in their own communities." Frank felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the outpouring of support on the screen. Messages of encouragement, requests for advice, offers of help. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. "You know," Frank said, softly, "when I first took that $2 job from you, George, I thought I had hit rock bottom. I never could have imagined it would lead to all this." George clasped Frank's shoulder, his eyes misty. "You took a chance on hope, Frank, and in doing so, you gave that chance to all of us." As the three of them stood there, surrounded by the warmth and vibrancy of the community they had helped to build, Frank felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, for there was still much work to be done, but the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. He thought of Helen, who had stood by him through every up and down, whose love and support had been his anchor. He thought of the countless individuals who had come together, each contributing their unique skills and perspectives to create something greater than the sum of its parts. And he thought of the future, not just for their neighborhood, but for all the other communities out there facing similar struggles. They had shown what was possible when people came together, when they refused to be passive in the face of change, but instead took an active role in shaping their own destiny. As the day wore on, and the diner continued to buzz with activity, Frank found himself returning to a phrase that had become something of a mantra for their movement. Community is not just where we live, but how we live together. Looking around at the diverse group of people who now called this place home, not just the diner, but the neighborhood it represented, Frank knew that they had created something truly special. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be new challenges to face, but they would face them together, stronger for the bonds they had forged. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the diner's windows, Frank raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. To second chances, to the power of community, and to the endless possibilities that arise when people dare to hope and work together for a better future. The story of Frank, the diner, and their neighborhood would continue, evolving with each passing day. But the foundation had been laid, strong and true, built on compassion, perseverance, and the unshakable belief that ordinary people, when united by a common purpose, can achieve extraordinary things. And in that enduring truth lay the real victory, not just for Frank and his community, but for all those who would be inspired by their story to create positive change in their own corners of the world. You may also like one of the 2 videos on the screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.